Okay, freewheeling philosophy for this channel. Previously, I spoke of the relationship of metaphysics to the types of metaphysics, I suppose, and that brings us to ontology. What I really ought to point out about ontology is, even though it's called theory of being, we ought to keep in mind that when ontology became significant, and it's only in the last 100 years or so that it has, what was occurring then was presentation by yet another German philosopher, Martin Heidegger, of a new approach to what is more or less subjectivity. Heidegger called that Dasein, and his subjectivity is referred to as Dasein. We don't refer to so much as Heideggerian subjectivity. But when we have the term subjectivity, we know we are, first of all, speaking about the phenomenon of the human, and can include human nature. So for philosophy that considers what Heidegger's done in that regard, we do have to reflect on what he meant by the concept of being, and particularly the historical concept of being. I think you can find in Enlightenment philosophers reference to being. Once you extract the intellect from the concept of God, which is the ultimate being or the initial being, if you like, and then moving to something else, not necessarily replacing God, but saying enough is enough, we need not carry on like children, and let's move philosophy in a different direction. So metaphysics at that time may well have other objects in mind, and I think I've spoken about not so much objects but the material. So if you're a singular metaphysics, that is that there's one item for your total concept of reality, so the universe, if you like, particularly accounting for your relationship in it, then you're monist, and it may well be materialist. What does the nihilist say about metaphysics? Well, it's a project that has a set of values, and because as a nihilist you don't engage in belief, you come to question what's going on with the value promoted by metaphysics. So in previous videos I had both contrasted types of idealism, types of metaphysics such as idealism, types of metaphysics, but also metaphysics in contrast with ontology. Ontology, from its rise in the 20th century via people like Heidegger and other existentialists, you've got a set of relationships in which you've really got to settle down it's sort of a housekeeping task to settle down some of these concepts and how they're going to connect to each other. So the housekeeping in that instance is, is ontology anything like metaphysics? And I noted that it was, but there's a particular difference. So we'll just crack this one and just say that being in ontology is not the only candidate or item that we're going to handle on behalf of ontology or phenomenology. Now we'll get back to the relationship to phenomenology. It's just that phenomenology as a discipline comes out of the philosophical tradition, particularly the European tradition. And we have to acknowledge the groundwork. So Heidegger's teacher, certainly kicked that off. But Heidegger's emphasis on being may well be justified, but it seemed to have come at the expense of another concept, which is another all-encompassing concept. And remember, we're not doing metaphysics here, we're just talking about the account of. So metaphysics is going to be the account of the world constructed of elements and molecules, for example. So really empirical approach. Science tells us we are satisfied that it's combinations of atoms that make up the universe, including ourselves. Now we know, of course, molecules and atoms don't make up our relationships. So it's kind of limited in that sense. It's got to have a human context. Anyway, when you're doing ontology, you can say, well, this account is a metaphysical account. So you've kind of accounted for its being. So it's being a metaphysics. And we noted a few: idealism, dualism, subjectivism, realism, and nominalism. So, using the history, let's just note that the alternate, and it's certainly not a pair, it's important to understand that these are standalone things. When we're doing ontology, it's going to be ontology of being or theory of being. So once your metaphysics, for example, is decided, well, material is the substance from which the universe is created, made, or consists of. And then we conduct that ontology along those lines. That metaphysics treats being in a particular way. Here's the being, here's the argument, this is what it's saying. Are we satisfied that that accounts for being itself? So we know what being is, we experience it. It's an integral part of consciousness, and you could say really that without being there is, I don't mean alive, I mean being itself. Without being there is no consciousness. That's sort of more philosophical talk, and I touched on language being a bit of a problem, so I don't want to dwell on that. What I want to get to is the point about being not being the only candidate for ontology. So just as we had candidates and quantities in metaphysics, we did not stop at one or two or more, and we did not stop at materialism. We looked at both materialism and then a mind-body, and that's some sort of basic stuff. But once you hit this relationship between ontology and metaphysics, you kind of, it's a bit awkward. You can't be hard and fast about your categories, because part of philosophy is about developing categories, and it's got a history of developing categories, and famously so. We have Kant's categorical imperative, which is in the background of a lot of human behaviour. So even though Kant kicked off that kind of the critical phase in philosophy, and philosophy has since moved on, it never lost sight of that need for a critical approach. So in terms of that, and particularly relationships, whether they're conceptual or not, we have that as a tool. We keep that in mind so we don't fall down into one or the other of metaphysics or ontology. We don't fall into a disposition in regard to being that we don't properly account for, that we have actually failed in a kind of well-rounded metaphysical argument. Is a metaphysical argument really that possible? Don't we just end up talking about relationships between words and concepts? In a certain sense, yes, but I think defining without being purely black and white and clear cut about it, but defining the relationship between ontology and metaphysics is the way to go, because reflecting and then re-reflecting in a more ontological frame upon a metaphysics is going to assist us to get from an ordinary common sense generalization to a really tight claim about our reality, and that's the role of the philosopher. So that's motivating me, and then at some point we'll look at the connection between what we know, and that can include what we know intuitively, personally, what we know and what we experience, and what we're then ultimately going to say is true or not. Okay.